Welcome back to Shifting Views with Willis, with me, Wayne Willis. This podcast is all about shifting views in business, community and society. Are young people becoming more anxious? Is mental health increasing in young people? Is education suffering? That's what we're discussing today. So on the show today, I'm pleased to welcome Christina Colmer-McHugh. Welcome, Christina. You're a wellbeing and resilience expert working with young people to try and improve resilience amongst all of your other worlds that you work in. Are children and young people becoming more anxious?
Yes, would be the short answer. I think certainly in my experience working within sort of mental health, from 10 years ago, bringing it right up to 2024 within emotional resilience, I do think that they have been in a constant state of flux since trying to settle back into school post-pandemic.
Yeah, and anxiety, mental health, emotional resilience, these are all words that seem to have picked up traction, particularly in the media now. We're hearing it all the time. What's the root of this? Has there been a significant increase, would you say, post-pandemic, or is this something that's actually just been aching for a long time and we're just becoming more aware of it?
I think, honestly, maybe historically, we've been able to work with young people to build resilience. But certainly in my experience, I think the mental health conversation has become very noisy. I do think that, when I first founded my first mental health technology company, which is really based around being able to, start those conversations around anxiety, the age that it begins at, when it starts to manifest and sort of impact young people. And then obviously 10 years on, I think the barometer, the pendulum has literally swung so far over that we need to find some stability for young people again. And by that, I mean, it's such a big conversation. It's almost, dare I say it, cool to declare mental health.
Yeah, it seems to be a trendy, almost. It's a horrible word to use, but it does seem to be an on-trend theme, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I think what's happened with that is that it's great to have that conversation, so it's not just a hushed conversation down a corridor or behind a closed door. But what's happened is that the people who really probably do need the help the most have been lost in that noise. There are many things, today that really can help bring that conversation out. But I do think that a lot of the time those who are acutely in need are still being sort of overlooked. And that's where the emotional resilience element comes in for me, because, over the past 10, 12 years, I've always been a firm believer in sort of self-development and self-resilience.
Sure.
And it's still a bit lost.
Is just thinking about the terms that get used, because they're so interchangeable sometimes, but is there a difference between, say, mental health, mental well-being, emotional resilience? Do these all mean different things, or is this like a spectrum? What do they mean?
I guess it depends who you talk to.
Yeah.
But personally, for me, and this is where my differentiator is when I go into schools to work with sort of GCSE age young people, is that mental health is something that may be an acute occurrence for school, and there are wellbeing teams and hopefully support in place for that.
Yeah.
Wellbeing, I think, should be a part and parcel of life. We should be encouraged to look after ourselves from a very young age so that we develop that internal ability to comprehend if we should be worried or not. And then obviously emotional resilience is something that I think should be intrinsically woven into the fabric of society and us, in that it's not necessarily what happens to you, it's how you react to it. And that's what I'm quite passionate about, is sort of really bringing that piece out and saying, look, we have a great percentage of the population who I would call the worried well.
Yeah, sure.
Walking around, hoping they're okay, not really knowing.
Yeah.
Whereas I think if you have that self-awareness piece, then you can maybe do something about it if it is acute, or really just go back to, this is what we're going through. Life can be hard.
Sure.
It's what you learn from that in terms of yourself and how you react to things.
Yeah. In your work that you're doing with schools and teenagers, and you're sort of preparing them essentially for post-school life, Have you found that there's a particular catalyst that's driving things? The obvious thing to me would be lockdown, COVID pandemic, but other factors might well be social media or other wider things that's going on in society, cost of living, negative news, war, whatever. Is there any, can you pinpoint any of these things?
Gosh, where do you begin? I think our teenagers are living with almost if you wanted to give it a label, almost like a secondary PTSD.
Yeah.
So their parents.
It's a strong term, isn't it?
It's a strong term. And when you unpick it a little, not to panic people, it's really all about that. What did your parents experience walking through the pandemic and lockdown? What's really coming out the other end is the nervousness passed from parents to child.
Yeah.
Are they okay? I hope they're okay. Why don't they want to go back to school? What is the issue? And a lot of the time, we are talking about mental health, but with the best will in the world, a lot of schools are still so under-resourced.
Yeah.
And teachers just really want to teach.
Yeah.
And trying to find those boundaries between teaching in the classroom and pinpointing somebody who perhaps needs more support. If they're really not coping at school, it sometimes can be just a gentle tweak and adjustment. But unless those conversations happen, then nobody ever knows. And I guess that's where my role and the team's role is to go into schools, have those conversations that aren't necessarily around mental health, but really about what's occupying their mind every day when they come into school. And a lot of the time, yes, we can still refer back to the pandemic and the lockdown, but it's actually recognising that and calling it out and saying that was then, this is now, what's the issue? And I think, there's a lot of stats that we can bring to this, but, when you think that, I think it's something crazy, like over 162% higher in terms of children who don't want to be in school compared with those in, pre-pandemic levels. Why is that? I think it's because they were given the choice as to how to learn. Maybe we don't warrant them with enough credit for actually doing the homeschooling thing.
Yeah.
But then as a society, we had a big divide between children of key workers able to go into school and stay at school versus those who weren't.
Sure.
And you've got parents who were trying to do their very best to homeschool, but equally try and keep down a job. No visibility in a very, very enclosed and, not fit for purpose home environment because we never thought we'd have to go through this.
Yeah.
And then obviously bringing it forward, those children who went through those years 7 and years 8 and years 9 missed out on so much that now they're expected to catch up quickly on 2 years of missed education and social skills.
Sure.
Totally went out the window. And
there's such crucial years, aren't they? Because that secondary school age, from 13 onwards, it's really when you're developing and you're finding yourself and discovering your peers and all that kind of stuff. And if you cut that, it's almost impossible to recapture that moment.
I think so.
That period,
Yeah, I think so. When you think about it, they had 18 months, 2 years of trying to learn in a home environment to then go back into the classroom. And although it was alien, and we never thought we'd have to go through that experience, to then have to go back to the discipline of getting on the school bus, going into school at a certain time, wearing a uniform again. And it's not just the students who've been affected, it is the caregivers, it is the teachers.
Sure.
It's the entire environment. And, a lot of people are pretending that they're absolutely fine when they're not.
Yeah.
And being able to acknowledge that is one piece that's missing in the jigsaw piece, I think, at the minute. But the other aspect is actually saying to those young people, you're a lot more resilient than you take credit for.
Sure.
But then when you hear that, I think nationally, 1 in 5 children or young people at high school isn't wanting to go into school.
Yeah.
Is not necessarily truant, but not even present when they are there. There's a lot more going on in their heads. We do have to acknowledge that there's something not right.
Yeah, and you made a point there about the effect on the caregivers and the teachers as well, and it's remembering that those teachers likely have children themselves as well, so that they are living that normal life, and so their experience probably what every other parent is experiencing. But I wonder also if it translates over to, I mean, we're focusing on teenagers and children at the moment, but it translates over to everybody, kind of the whole idea of remote working, not wanting to go back to work, that sort of same effect has kind of happened to some extent, getting up in the morning, commuting to work, sitting in an office with people. It's much easier to be at home on a computer. And some of that is rightly so. Some of it is under kind of flexible working, and we've discovered that, these work-life balance and all that, and there's definitely merit in that. But I just wonder, in terms of that resilience point, is that actually what's happening, what's underpinning that? Are some people thinking, I just can't face that world in the same way a child is saying, I can't face going into school. I've been without it so long now, that now to transition back into that world is too much for me.
Yeah, and I think it is. I think, to touch on the first point, as adults at work, we're able to hopefully make the choice between flexible working. So some days we'll work from home. Every day we might work from home, because we've discovered that in the lockdown we were able to still have a business and have a job and carry on. But our children haven't been given that option.
Sure.
So they see mum and dad staying at home, able to do what they want to do. The natural question for a young person is, why can't I do that? If the hybrid world is impacting, positively for mum and dad or an adult that they know, why can't they have that choice? And we know why they can't have that choice, because it's a fundamental aspect of growing up, is that you need to be able to show up, be there, learn, move out of the Victorian values of, chairs in a straight line and table in a straight line, but still show up to school, put a uniform on, and then get to the point where you're ready to move on to the next part of your life. And I do think that, it has swung so severely to, well, if you're not able to walk into the classroom or not able to go to school today, you obviously have a mental health issue.
Yeah.
When in fact, let's bring it back to the middle and say, we're not saying it's a mental health issue. We're saying it's a resilience thing.
Yeah.
Are we fatigued still emotionally from everything that we've experienced? And the acknowledgement that they've done a really good job of getting back in. But for that 1 in 5 who can't, why? Why is that happening, rather than, a disciplinary thing or threats of fines and stressed out parents who are already saying, I just can't get them in.
Yeah.
If they get them in, then you've got teachers stressed out saying, I can't keep them in the classroom.
Sure,
They're wandering the corridors.
Yeah.
They're in crisis.
Yeah.
But because we're not trained to deal with young people in crisis, we don't know what to do with them.
Yeah. And so, in your opinion, I mean, obviously you're working with these schools and you're going in as an expert to try and help them do this, but are schools realistically equipped to deal with these issues? As you say, the teachers are busy teaching. They're already overwhelmed with what it is that they're trying to do, let alone trying to be a mentor, a counsellor, a support worker, whatever you want to call it. Can schools really realistically deal with this?
At the moment, probably not. They'll do their best, and some are better than others. But I think what happens is, when you go into that learning environment, you have a curriculum to adhere to.
Sure.
You have content that you have to deliver, and you have to get those, measurables and KPIs in to see if your standards are good as a teaching profession, but also are the students listening. And I think the biggest problem is that they're just not able to think back to when they were 11, or they were 12, or they were 13. They've never lived through, in our generation, haven't lived through that acute experience of war. Not on our doorstep, but a lockdown is the same mentality. So then to expect those children to come back in and be expected to now think, okay, you're 14 now, let's not talk about what just happened over the past 2-3 years. Let's deal with now. the majority of the young people I work with, the very first conversation I have when they sit in front of me is, let's think back to year 7. Let's think back to 11 years of age. What did that look like for you?
Yeah.
And a lot of the time they'll say, I really enjoyed primary school, moved up to high school, and suddenly got a label or was seen as difficult, not academic. All of these labels get pinned on, not deliberately, but they do get pinned on because very quickly teachers have to think on their feet, is this child going to learn what I'm about to deliver?
Yeah.
Or are they going to disrupt the whole class?
Yeah. There's an auto pressure as well, isn't there? I always think, even when I went to high school, that transition from primary school into secondary school immediately comes with some baggage, doesn't it? Because it's immediately, you go into big school, your parent would say, you're going to big school, you're going to be doing exams, you're deciding your career. Now, everything starts becoming a little bit more pressured anyway at that age, as well as all the other stuff you're going through as a teenager and just trying to be human, let alone like trying to navigate what does your future look like? And, well, I don't know. I mean, crikey, I'm still a child, and then you throw in some cataclysmic huge event, like a pandemic or, endless amounts of negative media we hear around war, people being poor. And, we think that's just an adult thing, but it's commentary that young people are hearing and thinking about, I'm guessing.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's why I endeavour to really say, park all of that for a minute and tell me about you.
Yeah.
And no, I don't expect you to know what you want to be in a couple of years' time, but what do you want to be now? Well, I want to feel happier about myself. I don't feel that proud of the sort of person I am. My voice is a little bit lost in all of this. And some of them will say, I'm actually learning more from the curriculum on TikTok than I am than Mr. or Miss in front of me.
Sure.
And, it's really that without alienating the fantastic work that teachers do, which they do, a majority really do, and want to help that young person thrive and become the best version of themselves. When they're up against Mr. Beast on TikTok, who's going to teach them better GCSE history than anybody else ever could, where do you find the common ground? And I think what's really lacking in schools at the minute is mutual respect.
Yeah.
That respect for a teacher, that respect for a student's opinion. And what you have in some schools who really aren't equipped is just children running amok.
Sure.
Saying, this isn't working for me. I don't know how I can explain it to you without being disruptive, but this really doesn't do it for me. I feel like I'm being left behind. You've told me I'm not academic. Yeah. So even if they are, they have that total disbelief that they could ever achieve academically. And I think it's really, really important to actually treat them as a young adult.
Yeah. Is the education system in the UK fit for purpose? And I'm not talking about teachers. I think teachers are great. I'm talking about the system with which they're working. And does that need to meet more in the middle? And just referring back to your second point there, where you was talking about TikTok and YouTube and things like that, is there an apathy really amongst young people to say, I don't need that. Everything I need to know is here. Everything I want to be is here. I watch these people and I want to do that. And what you guys are giving me just doesn't resonate with me. And, there's this like chasm in the middle where there isn't, does the system need to adjust to this new world, if you like, the digital world?
Yeah, I think it does. Is it fit for purpose? I think with the best will in the world, there are certain aspects that really need to change. I think they need to stop fighting the social media element and actually embrace it and say, okay, how can we be more agile in the classroom? Can we bring in more online learning? Because let's face it, between the ages of 11 and 16, they're more likely to be focused and engaged with something that has a screen on it.
Yeah.
And no, we don't want to have a society of screen agers, but guess what? It's already happening.
Yeah.
Having that open dialogue with students about, okay, we want to make this topic fun.
Yeah.
We want you to get the most out of it. We're going to bring in that hybrid element of, yes, I'm in front of you, but let's engage that, social media element to elevate their voice
Sure.
in all of this. And then obviously, as you and I both know, using technology, it's only as good as the person using it.
Yeah, yeah.
Really ask them, their opinion on how they want to be taught. Do we still really need to have, exam halls full of students in a row?
Yeah.
They're already going through a big ordeal of actually getting used to actually sitting exams, and then seeing their name, where am I sat today? Those are anxieties that can be taken away.
Yeah.
Yes, we do still need to have exam conditions and invigilators, and actually to help with their resilience, we need to say to them, you need to sit this exam because you need to go through these experiences to develop resilience and actually help you, equip you for the next stage
But
of life.
it doesn't need to be such a pressured occasion, does it? I mean, that's the thing. It's almost like, some sort of mass event, like going to court or something, and you think, today's the day I'm sitting this, and I've got to sit very quietly for 2.5 hours around 100 other people, with people walking around looking over my shoulder.
Yeah.
And, if I don't get this right, my future's dead. There's a real crisis element that's built into it, isn't there?
There is. And I would say that the biggest piece for me with working with these young people within emotional resilience is, getting over that hideous scenario that they have built up in their heads, where I've seen, and I deliberately say, don't just give me the children who you think are struggling, give me the children who are overlooked because they're okay.
Yeah.
And then equally give me the gifted and talented ones, because ultimately none of them have sat this before. And what happens is I work with them over, the 6-9 months leading up to GCSE exam period. And some of them walk into the room and they can be as bright as a button, but if you ask them to sit and fill in a paper, they just melt.
Yeah.
And it's really even, I've even, me and the team have even just actually had them walk into the exam hall, practice it. Get this demon out of your head and actually practice it so that they can actually reduce that brain fog and sit down and actually feel really proud. And my biggest pride point is the fact that, all of the students that we work with, probably 25% of them weren't going to even sit an exam. And last week they sat them all.
Yeah.
And that's all you can really ask for, is that, yes, it's an archaic way of doing things, but there is no other way of doing things at the minute.
Yeah. Are we seeing a massive increase in young people not going to school?
We are. Yes, we are. And, I think the statistic there I cited earlier was literally over 160% increase.
Post-COVID, we're talking about.
Post-COVID.
Yeah.
Post-COVID. Why is that? And the students don't even know themselves for sure. The parents don't. Yeah. The parents I've spoken to don't. But I do think this goes back to this secondary PTSD element of, the caregivers and the home provision, and the parents did their very, very best in a majority of cases. But as soon as the school gates opened again, there was an audible sigh of relief.
Sure.
Because they're not teachers.
Yeah.
And then obviously their children have been used to either continuing study or just not, because they've said, look, we're coping with enough. We're not expecting them to follow on Google Classroom. We're not expecting them to go on to Teams call. And some schools did it brilliantly. Others were like, we get it, we understand, you just want them to play in the garden, the weather's good, and when are we ever going to get the chance to get back to nature as we did in those levels of the pandemic. But what's happened is that schools are expecting children to be the same as when they walked out of school for the last time that March when lockdown came. They're not the same people.
I think your PTSD line is so relevant because it is trauma fundamentally, and if we was to talk about trauma in any other sense in young people in childhood, there's some awful cases of trauma and you say, my God, that's terrible. No wonder they're struggling. But after this kind of massive period in the 2020 onwards, where there was such significant shift in life, it's almost, you can't just switch off the light switch and go, okay, and now we're back to normal again. Here we go, and start again, because the mind just doesn't work like that, does it? It's just sheer. And for some people, have coped with it really well, but for a lot of people, and particularly young people, they're really struggling. And if their parents are really struggling as well, and the community that they're in are really struggling, it's just a collective sense of fear, isn't there?
It is. It really, really is. And I think that's why I do what I do, because I want them to work towards a place of resilience again, of calling it out, saying that was really tough, guys. That was really, really tough few years that we had, but we are okay. It's made us stronger. We coped. We never, if somebody had told us 7 years ago, 10 years ago that this was going to happen, there would have been an even bigger outcry because people were expecting it. This was a shock to the system, huge shock. But what it actually did was, yes, it heightened everybody, but actually showed us that we have resolve. So I think that's the education piece that needs to go forward, is that we are resilient with support. We don't fight it. We embrace it, because I hate to say it, but the tsunami of whether it's, lack of resilience or mental health issues hasn't even hit us yet.
Sure.
This is something that is slowly unraveling. Yes, we have an outdated system, I would argue, healthcare and education.
Yep.
But with the best will in the world, we don't have the resources to change that anytime soon.
Yeah.
So maybe that goes back to the self-awareness element of really getting everyone together and saying, look, this was really tough, but we've got through it, which shows that we can.
Yeah.
And then obviously having that respect element, which I think is crucial, it went by the wayside.
Sure.
It swung from one direction to the next.
Yeah.
And the whole element of being sociable in crisis was totally overlooked.
Yeah. What role do parents play in all of this? Because I can already hear the people screaming. There's a lot of people that would be saying, what do you mean your kids aren't going to school? Take them to school. Back in my day, my parent would have brought, there's that real attitude to it. The parents are just not being tough enough. They're not implementing the rules enough or whatever. Do parents have a significant role? And are some young people, quote unquote, playing the system? Could that be a case? And I hate to use that term, but that's what people are going to ask. Is mental health actually becoming a trend? And while some people are really struggling, actually some people are kind of using it as a vehicle.
You're always going to get that.
Yeah.
To those parents doing their very best, I salute you.
Yeah.
And I think that's the vast majority, thankfully. But for those parents who are thinking, is that me? She's talking about, I've let such and such have a day off. Are they playing me? Honestly, I think the only way you're going to get to the bottom of that is to talk to your young son or daughter and say, I'm sorry if I've projected, or in their terms, I'm sorry if I've put any worries on you through that period, but I'm not worried now, so you don't need to be.
Yeah.
Just basic conversation. The art of conversation has been lost between some parents and their children. Technology's taken over. The cheapest babysitter I know is to basically, when you can't solve a problem, you say, here you go. And I put my hand up to that. I'm one of those parents who's done that in the past.
Yeah.
My youngest probably got a mobile phone 2 years too early.
Yeah.
Because simply she needed an outlet, and so did I.
Yeah.
So there's no criticism or blame towards parents here. But I do think society as a whole, whether it's mental health or it's education or it's business or whatever it is, there will always be that percentage, sadly, who play it to their tune.
There's talk of maybe, people not being allowed to have mobile phones now until maybe they're 16 or 17 or 18, because they're just not equipped to cope with the stuff that they're able to see. Is social media detrimental to young people? Well,
that is a big question. And I do think that, and this goes back to my days, having founded Moodbeam, mental health technology to really help you log those emotions and raise those questions. Our brains, when you think of evolution, Technology is making our brains and our heart rates move much faster than our body and brains were ever designed to do.
Yeah.
So you're being saturated with all of this content. You're having messages sent to you through 7 different platforms, and that is stress.
Yeah.
That's not good. We call it entertainment.
Yeah.
But actually, unless you have the the awareness that comes with age to decide if you should or shouldn't be doing that, that's too late for a couple of, 2 or 3, for this generation.
Yeah.
So is it harmful? I think in the context of education, it can be very useful. As I said, going back to the GCSE classes, by influencers and TikTok creators, that's useful. But it's not useful and so harmful to expose them to conditions that they didn't even know existed, to the point that they want to try it out. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case in a majority of mental health issues with young people, but it's a bit like, and I have to be careful here, when you are given choices to help you, if you don't understand the side effects of those choices, you will try them.
Yeah.
You will take them up. And I do think that it still comes back to the same thing, that even though the pendulum has swung from not talking about mental health right through to talking too much about mental health, those who need it most still aren't being heard.
Yeah. Technology has and social media and the internet and the whole digital age, I think it has such an important role to play in young persons' lives. And I also think it has a huge effect negatively in so many areas, some of the areas that we've just discussed. So, I don't think it's one or the other. I think the problem is it's that meeting in the middle, which comes to what you're doing, which is about resilience, being able to understand these triggers, these stresses. What do they actually mean? How are they actually affecting me, and how am I dealing with them? And that seems to be where it's lost, that bit in the middle, which I guess is what you're about. That's why you're working in schools.
Yes. Yeah. So I strive to have the brand and have the solution that I wished I had back then. Really something that would allow me to build that self-awareness, that self-resilience, almost that barometer that would allow me to remember and acknowledge what's best for me. Because it's ultimately, I say every day, it's not what happens to you, it's how you react to it that really matters.
Yeah.
Because if you can develop a mechanism that you go to when something happens, because stuff happens throughout all of our lives, but if you have a mechanism that helps you cope and react in a certain way that brings you back to you again, you can pretty much cope with most things, I would say.
Yeah. So how do we deal with the problem then? How do we deal with so many young people missing school, which we both accept is a problem? They need to be, you can't just miss stuff like this, because it's not just education, but they're missing essentially growing up, being around peers, understanding social skills, all of those elements. So it's obviously an issue that young people are missing school. How do you address this?
Well, I think you begin with them.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you don't assume. You don't pre-diagnose what you think is wrong with them. If they're being disruptive or leaving the classroom, it's not for attention. They are in crisis.
Yeah.
Why are they in crisis? That's what we need to get to the bottom of. Is it because they feel they don't fit in anymore? Is it because they feel that life's moved on and they haven't, or life's moved on too fast? We need to ask them, ultimately, because what that does is it helps teachers teach.
Yeah.
It helps wellbeing teams go to the source, but it ultimately helps that young person open their mouths, probably for the first time ever, and say, actually, it isn't what's happening to me now, it's what happened to me when I was 7 or 8 or 10 or 11. And once you deal with what's happened historically and learn how you should react, then you have a whole new person again.
Yeah. And I think there's a knock-on effect as well. And it's really interesting that you're working with young people who are coming towards the end of their secondary education, because they're transitioning to that adult life, if you like. But I think there's a knock-on effect in terms of prisons, crime. You know, the prisons are overflowing. So many people are getting involved in drug taking, various crimes, knife crimes through the roof. And I would agree with you. I don't think these people are criminal. They're committing criminal activity, but they're not criminals in their heart. They're traumatized. They're suffering souls. And actually, that's what we have to deal with before it gets to the point. What we're doing at the moment is just incarcerating people, sticking them in prison and saying, well, you've been really bad. You're not good for society. Out of sight, out of mind. The prisons get really full. Then we have to think what we're next going to do with it. But we're not going upstream and sort of saying, well, hang on, how are we even getting to this point? At this stage, they were just a child. They were a human. What was the trigger?
Yeah.
What was the thing? And that's what seems to be missing in education.
I totally agree. And what we're actually doing is going back 150 years.
Yeah.
Where we just incarcerated people because we didn't know what to do with them.
Yeah.
You know, and it wasn't just young people, it was women going through menopause.
Yeah.
You know, just stick them in an asylum and leave them there.
Yeah.
And that is not the way to go about it. You know, our system currently is failing our young people. I feel because we're going backwards rather than forwards.
Yeah.
I do think that we're all working in a state of shock still. No, those people didn't intend to harm others or harm themselves. But if that's your only aspect of control, then we need to look at what is being controlled for them.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the autonomy piece, the self-awareness, having choice. And no, the answer isn't just to pop them in there because the community can't cope with them.
Yeah.
They can't cope with the
And
community.
also, there's no solution to it because it's a cycle event. Most of them are coming out recommitting crimes. In fact, some of them find safety in prison.
Yes,
you know, that's what it gives them, you know, something to rely on almost, you know, and they can't cope in the outside world. And I'm not claiming in any way to be any form of expert on this, but it's quite obvious, you know, in terms of the journey of events. And I think if you to work backwards, obviously we're drifting onto a different topic slightly, but obviously prisons have their place, and you know people who commit horrendous crimes need to be not in society because they're dangerous. But for the majority of people, it seems to just be an outlet to put people in, and it's missing that fundamental point of how have you got to this point? You know, let's go backwards and backwards and backwards to when you were 13, 14, 15. What was happening in that point? And I just wonder to where we're at now from the COVID pandemic. You're dealing with the consequences of that with young people. What is that going to look like in 5 or 10 years? Yeah. Where are those people going to be if we're not addressing it now?
Yes, exactly.
So you have to invest in it now, right? Because you're going to be paying for it later.
You are, and those young people are going to be job seekers,
yeah,
or trying to run businesses, but always on the defense. Because the reason why anything unravels is because you don't feel safe.
Yeah.
And those young people in school who can't walk into school, who can't stay in the classroom, are going to be expected to hold down a job.
Yeah.
And then if we don't address it now, we have an even bigger problem then.
Yeah. And there seems to be a norm as well. We've spoken previously about this, but you was telling me about how so many children, when they are going to school, they're seeking medication, they're going to the reception or whatever, and they're asking for some form of medication or respite because they're struggling to cope. That can't be good. That can't be a good situation to be in where medication or other interventions are being administered to keep children calm in a school environment.
I agree. And I think what's happening is it's interesting, the young people that I speak to and that I've witnessed this, the older teenagers are more likely to look up the side effects and go, I don't want to go on those. You know, the younger ones who have managed to get into the health system, who have managed to get in with CAMS and not have the 13-month wait, are prescribed this medication. But for them to then be able to have it given in school, it will have to be by a member of staff.
Yeah.
And with the best will in the world, that to me is horrific.
Yeah.
Not that they need that medication. Obviously, somebody somewhere has decided that that is the right thing for them at this current time. Yeah. But it's the fact that office staff probably not aware of, administering this
They're just
medication.
fulfilling the role.
They're fulfilling their role, and they're doing a very good job of it. And the lines are blurred again between, pastoral and professional. But to actually see somebody of 11 or 12 who've probably been prescribed it, not necessarily for anxiety, it may be with another condition that they're living with. But for that to be the answer horrifies me, because there are so many holistic and alternative options to prescribe drugs, in my opinion. And obviously the pharmaceuticals won't want to hear that. But there are so many other options. Why should it be that somebody in year 7 is given that medication and is not aware of the side effects if they ever choose through choice to come off that medication? Then you've got a whole new set of issues.
There's a lot of interventions that are being lost as well, I think, and a lot of people think this is very soft and fluffy, but things around music, arts, expression, those kind of things, it's becoming more and more recognised, the role that these things, the way they affect us mentally, physically, in every aspect of our lives. But they receive so little investment, and so they're not viewed as any form of importance as the impact that they have on young people. But surely more and more of this kind of intervention would reduce the more negative kind of intervention when, essentially when it comes to medical or later down the line. Do we need to be doing more with the arts and those kind of softer skills, sports, whatever?
Well, you know how passionate I am about this.
Exactly.
And we both have such a love for mood and music, and that, that whole element of music for therapy, socially prescribed music, socially prescribed sport, socially prescribed, arts, and that is the answer for me. That is ultimately the answer where, yes, okay, GPs, and I know from sort of running mental health technology companies, they can't prescribe it, but they can recommend. They should all be on there first, not last. But, you look at the bigger picture, the funding being cut constantly for music and arts. The wrong people are making the wrong decisions. And society feeding down to, therapy are making those wrong decisions. And it all comes down to money.
Christina, I'm really aware that you've been really generous with your time, so I'm gonna bring it to a close. But I just wanted to ask you about, as we're recording this now, we're in the midst of a general election. Potentially a new government's coming in, or maybe the same government stays in. Who knows what the result will be? But from a government level, would you have a wish list? Is this something you would like to see from a legislation point of view that could trickle down through the country? And I'm just thinking, I know some of the parties are talking about putting a mental health professional in every primary school and every secondary school. Do you think that's a good idea? Do we need that? And are there wider things that you would like to see from a government level to try and improve the situation?
So I think my wish list would be more around self-awareness and emotional resilience. By that I mean not necessarily, with the best will in the world, popping mental health practitioners into every school. Usually they're people who need the help the most themselves and recognise that need, and then fall over by taking the weight of the woes of the people that they're working with. In the education system, it really needs to shake up. It really needs to not apologise for teachers wanting to teach, not apologise for wanting to bring in that sort of emotional resilience element to the curriculum. Ofsted, in my opinion, is not fit for purpose because it just looks at a KPI. It looks at one day of the year. And then equally,
in the same way an exam result looks at one hour in a hall answering a question.
Exactly, you beat me to it. So it's really a snapshot on one day does not reflect the capabilities and aspirations of a young person or a school. It totally needs shaken up. It needs to have that, flag flown that we are a school. Who cares? We involve our young people in the conversation. We promote respect. We promote resilience, and alongside Ofsted, if it may continue, is that major KPI of, do we care about our young people and how do we demonstrate that? And it's not a good or an outstanding or a bad. it's an everyday thing.
And finally, what do you think the future looks like for young people, particularly speaking for the UK, and given your experience of what you're doing now? Do you have hope for the future? Are you worried? What's your sense of where we're heading?
I'm an eternal optimist.
Yeah.
And I do think that if we collaborate, as we do, with our brands and with our aspirations, then we will break through that bias and that stigma, and the decision makers will have to listen. But I do ultimately think that there will come a point where young people, older people, will say, it's not down to somebody to tell me, it's me to tell myself. And that self-awareness and self-resilience element is what's going to get us through this. We will get through this, but there will always be wars. There will always be famines. There will always be bad people doing bad things. But ultimately, it's how we react to that. And if we can build a more resilient world, then we can see ourselves through this.
Christina Colmer-McHugh, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.